On March 2nd, 2017, social scientist Charles Murray was to deliver a speech at Middlebury College. He didn't get the chance. Several hundred Middlebury students stormed the lecture hall and shut down the night's program. It even turned mildly violent and resulted in an injured faculty member. This made national news. Conservatives disparaged the intolerant nature of the protest, silencing Murray from giving a lecture he was invited to give by a campus conservative student group. "What happened to free speech?" they cried. "Where is the commitment to the collegiate spirit of the free exchange of ideas?" In an open letter to the college, over 450 alumni objected to the event based on Murray's offensive views and his history of bias and shoddy scholarship. Their point was not one of free speech, but one of legitimization. Allowing him to speak allowed his ideas to be seen as on par with more accepted, rigorous opinion. This video is not about that night, at least not directly. I bring it up to show you the power of Charles Murray's scholarship and his work to this day. Unlike the alumni of Middlebury College, I don't worry about legitimizing this man. I worry about ignoring him. The right always accuses the left of living in these safe space hug boxes. People like Murray shatter our worldview, so we shut him down and can't be bothered to address what he's saying. It appears that we don't want to face these uncomfortable truths he has to give us. And yeah, fuck that. I want to face uncomfortable truths. I want my ideas to be sharpened. I want to face our enemies. But Charles Murray, he doesn't look like an enemy, does he? He looks like a sweet old man. He's a hard-working boy from Iowa. He graduated with an undergraduate in history at Harvard and a PhD in political science at MIT. He was in the Peace Corps for 6 years, supposedly. Sure, he was a political conservative, a libertarian in fact, and has spent most of his life in conservative think tanks like AIR, the Manhattan Institute, and most importantly, the mainstream conservative American Enterprise Institute, where he's been for the last 27 years. This is normal, isn't it? He has the bona fides of a normal Republican of the sort that we've seen in over 40 years of American politics. Shit, in this day of, well, not normal Republicans, he seems almost quaint. Why would I kick him out of my hug box? So why all of this? Why the rioting, the non-platforming, the fears of normalizing someone so damn normal seeming? The answer is because of the bell curve. This book right here, published all the way back in 1994. And with all due respects to books like The Turner Diaries and Mein Kampf and The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, I think this book, The Bell Curve, this book written by a Harvard professor and a best-selling social scientist, this 800-page science book, for lack of a better word, may be the most insidious book in the 20th century. It is impossible to overstate the influence of this book on promoting and inspiring some of the worst ideologies spreading around the world today. Yes, my friend, this image of a sweet and kindly mainstream American Republican, like our dads, but, even nicer. The calm demeanor and the intellectual heft, they mask the ugliest conclusions in science and in politics. But I'm certain that fans of this book will challenge me to prove his work wrong. They will say an ugly truth is still a truth, right? Maybe I'm the one that should get out of my SJW hug box and read this work, address what he actually says. Only then can I speak against it with any sort of authority. Only then can I make an argument. Hey, well, guess what, asshole? Challenge accepted. Let's talk about the bell curve. The Bell Curve wasn't really supposed to be Murray's book. It was pitched as being the definitive work of Harvard professor Richard Herrnstein, who focused most of his career on the nature of human intelligence. Herrnstein was something of a bit of a dinosaur in human intelligence circles, even back in 1984. He was a big team nature guy on all of the nature versus nurture debates going on in academia. He published works back in the early 70s that gave a full hearing to genetic theories and intelligence. These theories, along with other others by similar scientists were quickly considered antiquated and out of the mainstream of the field. The publication of Stephen Jay Gould's The Mismeasure of Man in 1981 basically ruined Team Nature for a generation of academic acceptance, leaving Herrnstein on the outside of his own field in his own era. The introductory chapter of The Bell Curve highlights his frustration with this fact, along with naming several forebears of his that Herrnstein believed were more on the correct path of scientific study, like Cal Berkeley professor Arthur Jensen. More on him later. For whatever reason, Herrnstein decided to bring Charles Murray onto the book project. Now, Murray was already a renowned political thinker on the right. He was enthusiastically respected for the 1994 book Losing Ground, American Social Policy in 1950 to 1980. This book is the origin of many right-wing talking points on social welfare programs and New Deal-era entitlements. It established much of the welfare queen mythos, the anti-affirmative action assertions, and the dogmatic belief that welfare makes people poor. I don't mean to suggest that he was considered out of the mainstream by any means. Even Bill Clinton complimented Losing Ground, saying that Murray's theories would undoubtedly work in America. Fucking Bill Clinton. And it seems obvious to me that Herrnstein approached Murray as a co-writer with the goal of shaping his data into prescriptive political arguments. He wanted the book to be a bestseller, and he wanted the book to find an audience with American conservative political circles. He wanted to punch back against those that had shouted him down for decades. No one who reads The Bell Curve and understands it will come away from it assuming that it's just a book of blind science, despite Murray's years of saying this shit. This book is not just meekly recording its numbers and assuming nothing towards the conclusions you could make from it. Thanks to Murray and his political framework, The Bell Curve was not an obscure white paper of data charts. Thanks to Murray, it was an argument for change in the American social structure. And I want you to remember that throughout this entire video. The Bell Curve was published by Free Press, a non-fiction imprint of Simon & Schuster, known in the 80s and the 90s for being the publisher of important right-leaning pop philosophical works, some of which were some of the most pivotal works of right-wing thought in that era. Its release was juiced by a cover story in the New York Times Magazine calling Murray the most dangerous intellectual in America. More famously, an entire issue of the New Republic was dedicated to touting the findings and arguments from this book. Edited at the time by the blogging pioneer and gay rights activist Andrew Sullivan, this New Republic issue proved to be so controversial that it is still an attack levied against both the magazine and Sullivan to this day. It mars everything he has done since. Sadly, Herrnstein would not live to see all of the hubbub made of his work. He succumbed to cancer just 1 month before the release of this book. The book was released to great sales, selling through its 400,000 copy print run in a few months, making it to the New York Times bestseller list. For the past 23 years, it has outlived works by better thinkers. It is still a top science book on Amazon and is frequently cited by those on the right for the implications that lie within its pages. What are those implications? I guess we should talk about what's in the book. The Bell Curve, Intelligence and Class Structure in American Life, very quickly states its 6 assumptions. The first one is a bit obscure, but crucial to understand. Number 1, there is a G factor. The G factor is a concept first established by Charles Spearman at the turn of the century that there is a general factor of cognitive ability. Basically, smart people are smart generally. Someone high functioning in math will generally be higher functioning in reading comprehension and language usage in much the same magnitude that they are for math skills. Conversely, the less intelligent among us are generally so as well. This theory has been hotly debated over the last 100 years, with the general consensus in 1994 mostly falling on the G factor's side. But by no means is this, or was it, wholly accepted. It's even more hotly rejected today. The G factor is now considered an older tool for understanding human intelligence. A statistician's tool, not a biologist's tool. And not a very useful tool, really, in any regard. But again, this statement was uncontroversial at the time. Number 2, the G factor can be tested for with standard aptitude tests, but the IQ test is the best designed to garner statistics. Number 3, what these IQ tests measure is what we generally classify as intelligence. Basically, that IQ tests are actually a good measure of one's cognitive ability, and not one's ability to manipulate such tests by cheating or deploying some scheme. These assumptions will be addressed later. Number 4, one's IQ score basically doesn't change over the course of their life. Let that sink in. No matter how much you learn in life, you are still conscribed to the same cognitive lot you have been born in since you were a child. Number 5, properly administered IQ tests were not demonstrably biased against social, economic, ethnic, or racial groups. This assumption is just the most dubious sounding sentence, which brings us to the core problem of this book. Number 6, cognitive ability is substantially heritable. Apparently no less than 40, but no more than 80%. Basically, you're as smart as your parents.
Mostly.
And that cognitive ability will be passed down to your kids.
Mostly.
A genetic heritage that is, once birthed, immutable and inescapable. Since, as you can tell from reading the book, that Murray and Herrnstein are more 80%ers than 40%ers, to them, you are basically all you are going to be, from the formation of your brain in the womb.
Mostly.
And yes, this is one of those statements that sounds so idiotic that you're almost driven to believe it, because what else but compelling evidence would ever drive someone to say something like it? Well, let's see what is driving Herrnstein and Murray to say this. In part 1, the authors look at how higher education has changed the workforce, based on the rise of IQ tests and other aptitude tests such as the SAT. American colleges changed from enrollments based on local legacies to meritocracy, where all people with exceptional IQ scores gained access to exceptional education. This, in their minds, was a positive shift towards the country, abolishing the old class systems and turning our best students, despite economic and regional barriers, into our best workers and leaders. Much of this is irrefutable. It's a great consequence of the 20th century. American colleges did change how we as a country viewed ourselves and our capabilities in the 20th century.
Mostly.
Highly intelligent students in rural Kansas would have never gone to Harvard in the 19th century, but now they do. And surely this is a good thing. But then the authors start to make prescriptive extrapolations based on this data, and that's a problem. They use this case study. In 1971, the Supreme Court ruled in the case of Griggs versus Duke Power. Now, Duke Power is a utility company in the Carolinas that had implemented an IQ test to all of its job applicants. Chief Justice Warren Burger ruled that since this general IQ test had absolutely nothing to do with the job skills required for their position, I assume pole climbing and meter reading and shit, the only effect of such tests were to discriminate against those in the populace known to perform poorly on IQ tests. Diplomas and tests are useful servants, Burger said in his judgment, but Congress has mandated the common sense proposition that they are not to become masters of reality. He went on to equate this practice to those of literacy poll tests, ruled unconstitutional by the Voting Rights Act. Murray and Herrnstein see these IQ tests for job entry as a great thing, leading to even better productivity in society. According to their beliefs, since some populaces in this country are by nature incapable of higher level cognitive function, we should hope to bar them from those important jobs in our society that may or may not require higher education, but nonetheless, we would want some barrier for entry, and that barrier should be IQ. Sure, these are some of the best paying careers in small towns across America, like electricians, plumbers, mechanics, and machinists, carrying with them some level of prestige and power and the opportunity for a middle class life. But the fact remains that some people should not have those jobs. Lower testing subjects will have to accept those jobs that correspond with their predetermined cognitive ability, as measured by this one test, sometimes only given to them as a young child. To Murray and Herrnstein, this is acceptable. In part 2, entitled Cognitive Classes and Social Behavior, the authors take all of this one step further. IQ is not just an accurate predictor of job performance and academic success in life. It is an accurate measure of your value to a society as well. It is in the aim of proving this point where the authors first employ the actual bell curve, and here where they introduce the source of their main data set. They use the National Longitudinal Survey of Labor Market Experience of Youth conducted by the U.S. Department of Labor's Bureau of Labor Statistics, wherein Americans aged 14 to 22 were given the ASVAB, a battery of standardized tests used for assessment in the U.S. Armed Forces. They were given this test in 1979 and then followed throughout their lives, up to 1993 for this book, to track their life choices. Most people choose not to attack their use of this survey. Even Stephen Jay Gould believed that it was best likely survey available for them to use. But it does have a couple of quick problems in their usage. One of them is that it is a little too short to make real generalities of the subject's life choices. The youngest subjects would have been 28 at the last data set, the oldest at 26. This is hardly a fair assessment of total life choices. Also, although the data set does include job information such as job wages and taxes for the subjects, Murray and Herrnstein ignore that information so that it's not a part of their conclusions. This seems to be missing out on a chance to have greater real-world shading to their findings. Most importantly, in this section, Herrnstein and Murray choose to use only non-Hispanic whites so as not to confuse their later point for part 3. Using this dataset, they showed conclusively that subjects with lower IQs were more likely to suffer from poverty, chronic unemployment, divorce, single parenting, and incarceration. The authors also create something called the Middle Class Values Index, by which they measure the total of these occurrences within each subject. The greatest trick in this chapter is that when the authors statistically account for known socioeconomic factors, such as parental upbringing, class, and health, they come to the conclusion that the best measure for accounting for the subject's success in adult society is actually IQ. They spend a great deal of time on each factor for social success and failure, giving a whole chapter to poverty, to schooling, to family structures. A lot of assumptions and prescriptive libertarian political policies lie within these chapters, but it's all in context for what they're about to talk about in the next part. It becomes clear that Herrnstein and Murray are IQ absolutists, believing that this number determines all of our life choices. And by this time, the reader does notice the heavy use of the term average, almost to the exclusion of the variances of experiences within those averages. But as incomplete of a picture as this is, they are making a good case for the importance of IQ in life success. I know what you're thinking right now. It is exactly what Murray and Herrnstein want you to be thinking. These authors are making the oh-so-controversial assertion that dumb people make dumb life choices. Why am I making a video calling these authors dangerous? You must be thinking I'm some kind of asshole now. But let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back to those first assumptions in the introduction. Let's remember that intelligence is hereditary. Mostly. And immutable. The NLSY shows that the poor performance and intelligence are not tied to environment or even life opportunities, those first few chapters of any biography you read. Success is tied to lineage, tied to just the first line of that biography, the line that states that you were born and to whom you were born. If your dad is dumb, you are dumb. Mostly. It would be impossible to imagine that an underemployed laborer, alcoholic, single father would have a child that, say, teaches himself to an upper tier of society, excelling at an upper tier job, and going on to shape the world and become one of the most important men in world history. That would be unimaginable. Because stupid life choices are tied to our total potential, and our total potential rests in our genes. Mostly. Not in our environment, and again, not in our opportunities. But that idea isn't that insidious, is it? It may be wrong, but you can argue that in good faith, right? Bring down the barricades at Middlebury, folks. This is all just a giant misunderstanding. This man is just debating the old nature versus nurture problem. This is intro to social sciences. This is high school bullshit. Maybe you are shouting at your screen, what are you not telling us? Why is this book worse than the Protocols of the Elders of Zion? Why are you being such a snowflake whiner? This is where Herrnstein and Murray finally open the kimono. This is why people do and should confront Murray for the dubious shit he says in college speeches. This is why I am making this video. And it's probably very obvious from the assumptions and postulations that have preceded it. We know where this is all going. Murray and Herrnstein start by giving us the sad but true fact that African Americans and Latinos perform consistently and substantially worse on IQ tests than whites do. For African Americans, this amounts to a 15-point gap between blacks and whites, not only on average, but across the distribution of scores. Asian Americans are actually shown to do better than whites by about 3 points, but understandably, most of the rest of discussion within and outside of this book deals with that 15% black-white difference. The first objection that people will have to this is that blacks have consistently worse socioeconomic conditions, which surely negatively impacts the subject's knowledge base and test-taking abilities. And of course, that is the correct attack on this, as we will talk about later. But Herrnstein and Murray do perform some weighted assessments to help show that this is not the case, that black IQ problems are unique to their race and do follow the model established for whites in Chapter 2, a model that shows that this low IQ makes them predisposed to crime, violence, and poverty. The tests themselves are biased, you will say next, also correctly as we will address later. But Herrnstein and Murray disagree, laying out study after study that shows these tests should not be considered biased. They do make several points that we will talk about later that does open the door to some possible environmental causes for the blacks' poor performance, and the authors conclude the chapter with a statement that sounds reasonable and moderate. Quote, "If the reader is now convinced that either the genetic or the environmental explanation has won out to the exclusion of the other, we have not done a sufficiently good job of presenting one side or the other. It seems highly likely to us that both genes and environment have something to do with racial differences. What that mix might be, we are absolutely agnostic on the issue. As far as we can determine, the evidence does not yet justify an estimate." And Murray slings this quote out often to show that his critics are wildly overreacting to his conclusions, based on their own liberal biases and anti-science sentiments. But make no mistake, viewers, I have actually read this book. This is not the end of his assessment of this data. He very much is on the side of the heredity of intellect, using studies by psychometricians such as Arthur Jensen, Travis Osborne, Richard Lynn, Linda Gottfredson, and J. Philippe Rushton, all of which we will talk about later. You start to see that they are giving you mountains of information that will lead you to personally conclude that blacks are genetically inferior to whites, at least when it comes to cognitive ability. They are, through every painstaking chapter in Part 3, feeding you an entire half-century of flawed statistics perpetuated by a race-obsessed funding foundation until you reach this conclusion in your mind. Only then do they concede that the evidence is not perfectly on their side, and they have chosen to moderate their claims. And they are sophisticated enough to know that they can't just say that blacks are irredeemably dumb and violent. They safeguard this tacit understanding of their true arguments by data dumping, verbal shoulder shrugging, and popping out vague statements of egalitarianism. But even after we sort through all of this, and we will sort through it all, you will definitely see that this is bullshit. We know this because that is why this book is still so popular. This is why it appears on the white nationalist reading list year after year, why it is considered a key text of the alt-right movement. This is why it sells so well. It's not because it's taught in psychology courses. It's not. It's not because it's popular generally. It's not. Your mom isn't reading this for her book club, I hope. It is key reading for those who already believe in the inferiority of blacks. And just as with anyone else who reads this book critically, it is very easy to see through the hems and haws about moderation that this is the author's true sentiments too. At about this time in the book, the authors get oddly obsessed with birth rates of the poor. I feel comfortable using quotation marks around the term poor now, since we know who they're really talking about. Herrnstein and Murray are very worried about the lowering IQ of America, with the high birth rates of the poor and immigrants being their acknowledged culprits. Murray and Herrnstein are quick to separate themselves from, well, others, I suppose, who would use this data extrapolation to demonize the cognitively lower races of Americans. Murray and Herrnstein are egalitarians, libertarians even, and they believe that the government should not do anything to negatively impact these lower races of people. That would be wrong. But they also feel that it would be equally wrong to do anything to positively impact these lower races. Because, well, what the fuck's the point? They ain't ever going to change, right? It's in their genes.
Mostly.
To be poor, to be criminals, to be overbreeders and underperformers. They can try, God bless them. And the bell curve dictates that some of them will achieve some level of greatness. But come on. Overall, these people are just, well, it is what it is, right? Alright, hey, let's be civil here. This is probably the part of the book of which they're the most proud. This is where the conservative political work is really done. First, they paint a picture of a dystopic future, one of a shrinking but isolated cognitive elite, sitting on gated mansions on the hill, hoarding their IQ and their money, while the majority of Americans are brutish and frustrated wards of the state, unable to achieve success at higher levels of society based on their lower cognitive capacity, but unmotivated to work menial labor because of the welfare state incentives. It is a high-tech Indian reservation, they say. Murray and Herrnstein really are irked that the cognitive elite don't breed more than they do. Them poors are breeding like rabbits because they are incentivized by welfare programs to do so. And worse than that, their children are starting to breed faster as well. The authors dream of a government policy to motivate the cognitive elite to breed in greater numbers. And since they agree that this would probably be foolish, they have this to say, quote, "The technically precise description of America's fertility policy is that it subsidizes births among poor women, who are also disproportionately at the low end of the intelligence distribution. We urge generally that these policies, represented by the extensive network of cash and services for low-income women who have babies, to be ended. The government should stop subsidizing births to anyone, rich or poor. The other generic recommendation, as close to harmless as any government program we can imagine, is to make it easy for women to make good on their prior decision not to get pregnant by making available birth control mechanisms that are increasingly flexible, foolproof, inexpensive, and safe." And this is surprisingly feminist of them, but it does read as, "Hey, poors, come get your totally voluntary sterilization right here." In the end, this book feels that it has proven that white people, mostly, and I guess Asians, are the cognitive elite in this country. Not all white people are the cognitive elite, but the cognitive elite in this country are kind of all white. Mostly. And I guess Asians, The poors in this country are all stupid, which is totally fine. But they're all stupid, and most of them are black, and we should accept that. There are plenty of jobs for them at the post office. Maybe they can try custodial work, noble custodial work. They shouldn't go off trying to be doctors and lawyers. It will just frustrate them, and we should never incentivize them to make these decisions. It's just not in their genes. Mostly. And the only thing that we can hope to do in this country is to minimize how many problems these stupid idiots cause for the rest of us. It would be easier if they just stopped having stupid babies, but I guess that's not going to happen. Maybe we should just stop paying for their childhood wellness and food stamps to feed these stupid babies. Who knows, maybe there will be less stupid black idiots in this country if we do that. But we gotta do something or our country will be nothing but super dumb idiots. This is the effective thesis of the book. This entire book is a shell game to change the conversation about white supremacy in this country. We want our smart people to be in the best positions, right? We don't want incompetent morons ruining our country, right? Well, the science shows that white people are smart and black people are dumb, and there's nothing to be done about that. Mostly. Now let's establish the fact in our minds and go back to this smart people, stupid people conversation about where we want this country to go. If you want smart people running it, you want white people running it. And if you don't want dumb people running it, you don't want black people running it. You are not racist for thinking this. This is science. You're just a free-thinking skeptic that looks at all the facts to reach a conclusion based on evidence. Am I right? This is all too far, you say. It's too gross of an accusation to throw at Charles Murray and a late Harvard professor. I am being a liberal SJW overreacting whiner cuck, and I'm being disingenuous to sweet old Charles Murray. If that's what you think about me, you best come at me, motherfucker, because I'm just getting warmed up. Let's get ready for the takedown. Since Herrnstein and Murray pepper their works with such candy-ass phrases as mostly and it's science, I can too. Obviously, we are creations of our genes, and our genes are the first thing we inherit from our parents that truly disappoint us. And since tall people have tall kids, mostly, and black people have black kids, mostly, and asshole people have asshole kids, mostly, it stands as basic rationality to assume that dumb people have dumb kids. Mostly. But are these assumptions really rock-hard genetic truths? Obviously, my easy joke on the Trumps belies the real notion that these kids are, well, They were raised in this place. They had this guy as a father figure and had to read gross details about him cheating on their mom in the newspaper in which he leaked the information. These kids didn't stand a chance, but that was because of their environment, surely. And race itself. The black people have black kids, white people have white kids belief. Well, surely that's true. Surely race is hereditary. Well, is it? Does President Obama look like this woman? Are these twins the same race? Is this man a Mexican? What is race? Well, when you look at it from a genetic level, which we can do now since Murray and Herrnstein published the book, the picture is now even clearer. The science is conclusive that genetic variation within racial groups are greater than those variations between these racial groups. Think about that. I can say it again if I have to. The science is conclusive that genetic variation within racial groups are greater than those variations between them. Black people have less in common with other black people than they do with white people, which is good because I've always identified more with this guy and this guy than I ever did with those people, for which I clearly came. In a very real genetic sense, we are all Africans, with only the smallest fractions of variations separating Europeans and Asians. We are all more similar than the different types of apples at the grocery store. In fact, this entire race conversation, from a biologist's perspective, is silly. From a purely scientific, modern biological perspective, there are either 350 genetically different races on Earth, 250 of which reside mostly in Africa, or there is just one race. From a genetic perspective, race is entirely bullshit, and we now know that. Look, sure, skin tone, lips, eye shape are key features to who we think we are, but maybe, just maybe, humans want to put more focus on these unimportant cosmetic anatomical features than our genes do. And now how about that height thing? Let's talk about that for a second. Surely tall parents have tall kids. Surely height is genetic. And it undeniably is. Tall people do have tall kids. Short people have short kids. But sometimes they don't. Just 70 years ago, the Korean people were an homogeneous culture with minimal immigration and no real breeding outside of their racial group. They shared heights that conformed tightly around an average Korean national height. Today, for the most part, the same is true about their homogenization, low immigration, and genetic stability, with the added complication of an artificial border and wildly different quality of lives on the differing sides of that border. South Koreans are now, on average, 3 inches taller than the average North Korean. And we all understand that that has to do with living conditions and nutrition. Genetics and evolution is clearly not the answer to this question. And I am taller than both of my parents. A lot of people are. So human growth is genetic except when it isn't? Of course we know this. We know that if we take seeds from a particular hardy crop and grow them in differing soils, we get differing yields. Genes and environment, right? And who can fucking tell which is really which? Murray is going to say that he makes this point in this book, but I think making the point belies the entire rationale for the book. But let's go deeper. I think it is useful to categorize all attacks on Murray and Herrnstein's book into 4 categories. Number 1, Murray and Herrnstein's black box. Since the bell curve's conclusion that a major element of intellect is racially classified, certain common assumptions can be hypothesized from this assertion. The more rigorous the assertions prove out, the stronger the assumption, right? For instance, blackness as a race is indicated to be of inferior intellect. So let's make a hypothesis based on the bell curve's conclusions. Blackness is negatively tied to intellect, so since races can and have been mixed, the level of blackness in a person would correspond with cognitive ability, making a gradient scale of IQ scores, with the blackest individuals having the lowest IQs and the whitest having the highest. This makes rational sense, right? Well, that doesn't happen. Since 1966, we have known that IQ does not correspond to skin color at all. But I just said earlier that physical blackness has nothing to do with Africanness or racial blackness, and that is right. using genome and blood markers to discover the percentage of European and African gene markers within a subject, there is still no correlation between how black you are and how intelligent you are. It seems that nature is oddly binary in the inferiority of racial intelligence. Any blackness is total blackness. Nature, it turns out, is literally Manichaean. It is almost like these racial differences are, arbitrary, as if society has its thumbs on the scale with this one, but I digress. Also, let's scrap the whole American racist history thing. Let's focus on American black kids not raised in American black homes. Outside of the seedy origin of the circumstances of this study, it is a commonly understood fact that many children born in post-World War II Germany were fathered by American soldiers. Some were black and some were white, obviously. A scientist by the name of Efforth did a 1961 study of several hundred black children left behind to be raised in German society. Their average IQ was identical to those white children left behind to be raised in Germany. This does not point to a correlation to genetic blackness and low IQ either. Also, if this is true, and since your parents are just a set of genes and are largely irrelevant to your cognitive ability, it holds that it shouldn't matter which parent is black in mixed-race children. Their IQs should be the same regardless. But they aren't. Black children born to white mothers enjoy IQs on average 9 points higher than those born to black mothers. Black kids in white adopted homes do better in IQ tests than kids adopted into African American homes. Studies of black and white orphans raised together in a quality institution have similar IQs. In fact, blacks have an advantage in some of these studies. There are only 2 real studies of black children divorced from typical black environments that support Herrnstein and Murray's thesis. One is a bullshit study that is now believed to have been totally faked, and the second is a study so uncontrolled that the authors themselves cautioned against using its findings. Murray and Herrnstein choose to excuse the first study's clear fabrication and use the second study to extrapolate greatly from it. None of these other studies were mentioned in the book at all, because the bell curve is not a serious book of study. It has an agenda to uphold. Number 2, the Flynn effect. Like Professor Selvig in the Avengers movie, the bell curve actually constructed an element of its own destruction within its pages. They even gave it a name. On page 307, the authors label a curious quirk of IQ statistics known as the Flynn effect. Now let's unpack what that truly is, and finally, at this late hour, introduce a hero to our story. James Flynn, also known as Jim Flynn by assholes who like to call people by shitty first names, was an American-born intelligence researcher and activist working in the University of Otago in New Zealand. Starting in 1984, Flynn compiled mountains of IQ test scores spanning the entire century from over 30 countries. And he noticed a startling thing within the galaxy of data points. Humans are now all statistical geniuses. The average IQ has been rising 0.3% a year or over 3 points a decade for most of the 20th century. So imagine an American born in 1930. He was the average American, so he has an IQ of 100. He marries an average woman and they have an average son. But his son's IQ will be 108, which is a colossal generational leap for Herrnstein and Murray standards. The third generation of the Averagons, I've named them the Averagons, will have an IQ of 120. Conversely, the average teenager today with a 100-point IQ would have had a granddad with just 82-point IQ. How does genetics
mostly
explain this? How could evolution work that fast? Maybe you aren't measuring cognitive ability. What if this is all bullshit? James Flynn says in his 2007 book, What is Intelligence? How can such huge gains be intelligence gains? Either children today are much brighter than their parents, or at least in some circumstances, IQ tests are not good measurers of intelligence. Flynn believes, with strong evidence, that IQ tests don't measure some G factor of general intelligence, but instead they measure a person's ability to adapt to modernity. An example he gives is a question within the WISC's section on similarities. This is a common IQ test. When asked to show the common relation between a dog and a rabbit, the modern student, schooled exclusively in abstract categorization and innate relationships, would answer that they are both mammals, which is the correct answer for this test. Someone from just 70 years ago might have said that the dog chases the rabbit, a much more real-life relationship to a more rural student with an agrarian skill set. Early last century, Southern Italians scored just as low as African Americans on IQ tests and were considered genetically inferior by the Charles Murrays of that day. But today, Americans of Southern Italian heritage enjoy IQ scores well within the American average. What changed for them? Clearly, they were allowed into the common social order of American life and into the abstract thinking of modernity, away from the concrete agrarian relationships and the rudimentary survivalist concerns of extreme poverty. But you were saying, fuck that, Forever James. Let's talk about the blacks. Well, the Flynn effect is more impressive there. Even in the bell curve, Herrnstein and Murray have to acknowledge that black IQ did rise astonishingly between 1945 and 1970, faster than whites rose over that period, therefore closing the IQ gap some in that interval. This is surely because of environmental changes in black communities and the modernization of black lives. But something happened, something Murray always brings up to cover his ass. That black IQ increase stalled from 1970 to the year after the bell curve was released. Murray likes to note that we have gotten the most juice out of environment we can. Now we are left with a pure state of black dumbness, he seems to be saying, and that is what the bell curve was showing. But unfortunately, the data didn't stop in 1994. A 2006 study by Flynn showed that the gap between American whites and American blacks had closed up to 6 points between 1972 and 2002. That's more than a third of the 15-point IQ gap between blacks and whites. Within a generation, this entire conversation could be thankfully over. This growth was separate from the general Flynn effect that continued to show a general rising of the world's IQ. Even Murray broke with his more racist-ass school of gene separatist friends in 2006 and admitted that the Flynn research was correct here, though he quickly said that growth had stopped in 2002. For Murray, it seems that the cognitive inferiority of blacks will be conclusively discovered forever someday in the future. I shouldn't gloss over some of the more problematic elements of Flynn's thoughts. He is a civil rights activist and a democratic socialist, which automatically makes him like my second favorite James. But he has harsh opinions on black culture that he says sets the disadvantageous environment for intelligent offspring. He's especially hard on American black culture. He has done many studies showing that blacks raised in adopted white homes and blacks raised in other modern cultures, such as in Germany, have much higher IQs and experience more success than those raised in American black homes. Though clearly sympathetic to the ongoing fight for civil rights in America, he is a bit of a pull up your pants and stop listening to that hip-hop kind of guy. And if that bothers you, and it should, that is an element of his work with which you will have to grapple. One last thing before we leave Flynn. He notices one interesting point about black IQ that I think is worth mentioning. When given rudimentary standardized tests, white and black babies have equal IQ scores. At the age of 4, there is a 4.5 point difference. Then, from the ages of 5 to 25, blacks lose 6/10 of an IQ point a year. Why could that be? Why could it change as you age? Why could the Flynn effect stall for blacks in 1970? And on both of these, Flynn doesn't have an answer. Flynn has a black box of his own, which leads to the conclusion, is Charles Murray right? But if Charles Murray's right, that wouldn't explain how blacks lose IQ as they age. Neither one of them seems to have an answer for each other's problems. And perhaps there is a reason for that. Perhaps there is a reason so hidden that even Superman couldn't see through it. Part 3. Are blacks being poisoned? Yes. Yes, they are. And we have known about it for decades. Let's talk about lead. The story is commonly known how America and the whole world lost its damn minds in the 19th and 20th century by using a substance known as a poison for 2 millennia on everything imaginable. Turn-of-the-century homes were slathered in lead paint. We built water pipes out of lead. And since that was not enough, in the 1920s, we decided to vaporize it into our air with the use of leaded gasoline. Lead poisoning has 2 types of toxicity. Acute poisoning, throwing up and diarrhea and shit. And the more pernicious, chronic poisoning. We're only talking about the chronic poisoning of lead right now, specifically childhood exposure. It is well known that lead exposure lowers cognitive ability, IQ, and it increases erratic, violent behavior. This has been documented since literal antiquity. Lead studies in infants and school-age kids have been extensively studied, showing a greatly consistent picture, giving us great data on this. And thanks to that data, we can extrapolate a great deal about the nature of childhood lead exposure and IQ. This is what a correlation looks like, Murray. IQ lowers as childhood lead exposure rises. It is as close to a 1-to-1 correlation as you can get. This is understood on a neurochemical, subcellular, and cellular level, with countless studies showing how just minute levels of lead can degrade the human brain. And for that matter, lead exposure probably solves the greatest mystery in 20th century social sciences: the inexplicable rise of violent crime in America. The most damning chart on this subject, probably one of the most interesting charts in all of science, is this chart right here. The blue line graph shows the rise and fall in the usage of leaded gasoline on American streets from 1937 to 1986, when it was finally outlawed. The brown line is the rise in violent crime from 1960 to 2009, 21 years after an infant would have been born into such a leaded atmosphere as corresponds to the blue line. Similar charts can be shown for teen pregnancy. You can even create correlations based on low median income neighborhoods and high soil lead levels. But no one made this connection during the bell curve debates. That is until 2012, when our second hero, anti-lead crusader Rick Nevin, decided to address it in his amazing paper called Lead Poisoning and the Bell Curve. It really should be the absolute end of any debate about Murray and Herrnstein's book. He completely destroys their premises, inverts their findings, and recontextualizes the entire 20th century in its scant 24 pages. You should just be reading his damn paper instead of watching this crap. He put it together in an Amazon Kindle single called The Lucifer Curves, which you can download here for $2, I believe. According to this paper, when you apply basic blood lead statistics to the same study Herrnstein and Murray were using, you see a whole different tragedy in front of you. We know that the bell curve was using the NLSY, which measured IQs of kids born between 1957 and 1965. We know that the blood lead level in children were reaching their peaks at these points in history. We know lead's effect on IQ, on mental retardation, and we know the lower income children across the board have higher levels of lead. But you say, we know that the NLYS shows that if you control for socioeconomic standards, blacks still have lower IQs than whites across the board. I have not given you an answer to that, but I think we have one now. African Americans, regardless of socioeconomic class or income, were more prone in the 20th century to have higher blood lead levels based on their propensity to live in older homes in urban areas, regardless of class, while even the poorer whites of that time period still tended to be raised in the newer, less polluted suburbs. For a pop culture case in point, the Huxtables, a black family with the father as an obstetrician and the mother as a lawyer, still live in a turn-of-the-century brownstone in Brooklyn, while the Bunkers, a working-class white family, lived in the suburbs. And this was an accurate representation of how the races lived their lives in the 20th century. Urban areas seem to be the key to this problem because you have the double danger of pulverized lead paint dust in older homes and apartments combined with the urban concentration of leaded exhaust in the air. This creates an inverse bell curve of blood lead levels to correspond to those showing IQ in the book The Bell Curve. Nevin goes on to postulate that what Murray and Herrnstein were unwittingly looking at in their statistics was the sad extent to which we impaired an entire generation of Americans by allowing our kids around a substance we knew to be dangerous. And guess what, folks? We are still doing this right now, all over this country. Lead exposure is still a critical issue for Americans across the country. Blood lead levels also has the added advantage of explaining away many of the facts hidden in Herrnstein and Murray's Black Bach. Black kids adopted into white homes were being adopted away from toxic urban environments. Black kids raised in Germany enjoyed air less polluted by lead gasoline, for Germany used less of it, and the fuel additive was banned much earlier than in other nations. Also, Germany banned lead paint in the 1920s and had, let's say, fewer pre-war buildings in urban areas after World War II. Blacks and whites raised in the same orphanages would have had the same blood lead level exposures, hence the same IQ results, and it even explains the one twin study that Murray and Herrnstein do cite, as they are measuring the adoption of older black kids who still would have been raised in the same toxic environment as non-adopted black infants. I'm hard-pressed to find a point on this debate about African American IQ levels in the Western world that could not be explained away by either the Flynn effect or lead exposure. I mean, seriously, come at me, motherfuckers. I'm looking for a point here. After all of this, what is Charles Murray's point of view? And I don't want to gloss over the fact that these were known problems. The Flynn effect was named by Murray and Herrnstein, but that was mainly just to lampshade what they viewed as their biggest potential problem in the book. And Congress has been studying lead toxicity since 1966, with Claire Peterson's damning water studies being hailed as conclusive proof that leaded gasoline and General Motors had poisoned the entire American population. We knew this. So why was all of this bullshit published in 1994? Why did the APA do a special review of the race IQ question in 1996 and still get it wrong? Why are people looking at this data and not making necessary connections to solve this problem conclusively? There are two reasons for this. Number 4, the problems with the answer. The second reason is simple, it's politics. If black and whites have equal genetic opportunity to thrive in this country, it is our fault as a nation if they don't. If blacks are systematically oppressed, we have a moral imperative to do something about it. If that means forking over full federal funding for lead abatement, then Paul Ryan can't give tax cuts to rich people. If that means that we have to spend more on schooling and early childhood health care, then Paul Ryan can't give tax cuts to rich people. If that means that we need fair hiring practices and more dynamic higher education funding, then Paul Ryan can't give tax cuts to rich people. And if more people become upwardly mobile through federal programs, they are more likely to see the need for this higher federal spending, and we will have less public consent for Paul Ryan to give tax cuts to rich people. The rich want their tax cuts, and the rich pay for their senators and congressmen. And these assholes need science to back their compromise positions, so people are funding scientists to produce that data. It is better for the rich elite in America if black people's position in society is black people's fault. Even more so, it is better if black people are essentially unhelpable because of scientific fact. And that is what Charles Murray wanted to prove to you. But the first reason is far more complex and far grosser. And Murray, and especially Herrnstein, are not as removed from this as they want you to think. Let's talk about those questionable sources we mentioned. Murray and Herrnstein are a part of a long legacy of pseudoscientists, monomaniacally obsessed with race theories in the hopes of objectively proving racial differences so we can justify oppressing black people. Many of the most exalted of those scientists they cited are now dead, but those that remain consider Murray one of their own. They think that because he is one of them. After all, his is built on a foundation of racist research. Racist research like published in the Mankind Quarterly. The Bell Curve cites 5 articles published in Mankind Quarterly, but 17 scientists cited in the Bell Curve has published works in the Mankind Quarterly. 10 of those were editors for the periodical. Founded in 1960, Mankind Quarterly was founded to combat the cultural Marxist idea that there was no racial disparities. The crimes of the Nazi, wrote Robert Geyer, Mankind Quarterly's founder and chief editor, did not, however, justify the enthronement of a doctrine of a-racialism as fact, nor of egalitarianism as ethnically and ethically demonstrable. The magazine was a fierce defender of apartheid and the ultra-right colonists in Rhodesia. It supported the U.S. White Citizens Council, who fought against Brown versus the Board of Education, and gave a platform for the designers of Italy's fascist regime to defend themselves after the fact. They published articles on racial-based eugenics, mental inferiority of blacks, and anti-Semitic attacks on the reasons for Jewish immigration. Mankind Quarterly, though published in Scotland, was funded by a notorious New York-based foundation, the Pioneer Fund. The Pioneer Fund is founded in 1937 by a race-obsessed textile magnate named Wycliffe Draper and ran by a eugenics leader, Harry Laughlin. Both were huge proponents of the Nazi regime and their race-based policies in particular. Despite trying to sweep this all under the rug after the war, their race aims remained true to their founders. As late as 1989, they were advocating the abandonment of school desegregation because raising the intelligence of blacks or others still remains beyond our capabilities. Draper himself actively wanted to remove African Americans from the U.S., returning them back to Africa. They spent millions of dollars on research grants to keep race-obsessed psychometricians pumping out work that backed their toxic worldview. Outside of those scientists published in Mankind Quarterly, Murray and Herrnstein cite 13 more recipients of Pioneer Funding's patronage, totaling $4 million of total funding produced to cite evidence published in the bell curve. One of the main scientists cited heavily in the bell curve was a towering figure of modern psychometricians, Cal Berkeley's professor Arthur Jensen, who received $1.1 million of funding from the Pioneer Fund and is one of the most debunked and criticized proponents of the gene theory of intelligence. He was a favorite punching bag of both James Flynn and Stephen Jay Gould. To strengthen their attempt at defending Jensen's work, Herrnstein and Murray feel the need to cite the race IQ work of Georgia Bulldog Travis Osborne, a Pioneer Funding recipient and expert witness for those attempting to overturn Brown versus the Board of Education. The worst use of evidence with these Pioneer Fund recipients has to be its heavy use of race IQ studies by Richard Lynn, a psychology professor from the University of Ulster. In his article for the New York Review of Books, journalist Charles Lane, pictured here soundly vanquishing Darth Vader, wrote a complete dismantling of Richard Lynn's deeply flawed surveys on racial intelligence and Murray and Herrnstein's deceptive use of this Mankind Quarterly editor's work, whom the bell curve acknowledges to have benefited especially. This should be enough to prove that the bell curve is bullshit and just a prettied up version of the same non-science, race essentialist bullshit that's been churning out for at least the last 150 years. But I have one more delicious example to give you guys. This one's just for fun. You guys have earned it. In an attempt to stay relevant and defend his reputation, Murray wrote a follow-up article for the neoconservative magazine Commentary in 2005. It was sexily entitled The Inequality Taboo. His purpose in writing the commentary is ostensibly to defend then Harvard professor Larry Summers for saying that chicks just weren't mentally all that good at math. But he soon finds his way on to touting another race IQ piece co-authored by our old friend, Arthur Jensen. This piece, entitled 30 Years of Research on Race Differences in Cognitive Ability, finds Jensen working with the then current Pioneer Fund president by the name of J. Philippe Rushton. This piece is nothing special. The same surveys of IQs and the extrapolations of what race is better at which. Murray is trying to use this work to prove that the Flynn effect is measuring IQ, but not measuring the G factor, to which Murray said in the bell curve that the IQ test was best designed to measure. Basically, blacks are getting smarter, he concedes, but not smart in the right way, so fuck them. Let's focus on Rushton, though. Sweet, beautiful Rushton. A professor at Western University in Ontario, Philippe Rushton, like most race realists, was obsessed with black men's cocks. He believed that there were only 3 races, which I assume makes the dick measuring easier, and that would be Negroid, Mongoloid, and Caucasoid. If one could sort humanity out on a continuum of IQ scores, you will notice that their dick sizes would negatively correspond to where they fit on the intelligence continuum. If you think this sounds like a bad comedy routine, I totally agree with you. He posed a theory called the R/K selection theory. Some races adapt to fathering a ton of children with minimal concern for parenting or the health and well-being of the offspring. This is the R selection type. Others try to father smaller broods with a higher commitment to culture and parenting, the K selection. To Rushton, the Asians are the race hardest committed to K selection, which is evidenced by their smaller penises and larger brain sizes. And obviously we can guess who Rushton puts at the extreme R selection, our friend the Negroid. Whites, or Caucasoids, are to Rushton the baby bear of the brain-penis divide. White penises are just the right size, it turns out. To Rushton, our genetics also determine our sexual appetites, and again, surprise, the blacks are left with the shit side of the lot. Rushton's Negroids are predetermined to be stupid and controlled by their unending lusts. They have no concern for family or culture, no commitment to civilization, just a drive to violently roam the land, committing crimes and trying to fuck everything they see. Asians, who in the real world have been historically palsied with crippling overpopulation, just aren't that into sex. According to Rushton's theory, they're just overthinkers and middle managers raising their 1 or 2 kids ridiculously well. Okay, I ain't gonna split hairs here. Rushton is a total fucking charlatan quack. He has been running a hustle of psychology studies for decades, taking advantage of his esteemed university's tenure and what is already one of the softer, less rigorous sciences to advance his little racist theories. Unable to get the quality penises he needed for his theory to work, he more than once cited thinly masked pornography into his scholarly research, including one study by author P. Nobile, which was originally published in Forum, International Journal of Human Relations. This publication is better known in America as the Penthouse Forum. He has been disciplined by his university for paying his black students to talk about their sex lives. He has frequently published articles for American Renaissance, an organization that is openly white supremacist, now calling themselves alt-right. From 2002 until his death in 2012, he was president of the Pioneer Fund, which by that time had only had one funder. And in the last few years, the only people in the mainstream who choose to call Rushton something less than a shit excuse for a racist scientist was Arthur Jensen, special advisor to the bell curve Richard Lynn, and Charles Murray himself. This is the level of science we're talking about. I'm not going to do Charles Murray the benefit of calling him a racist. Well, maybe he would call himself a race realist. He is definitely a race essentialist. But he also considers himself a scientist who is just asking questions based on data that he has. If his conclusions were irrefutably right, which they most definitely aren't, we would have to conclude to him the high ground of scientific accuracy. We would surely have to say the same thing to Philippe Rushton, or Arthur Jensen, or Joseph Goebbels, I suppose. I mean, here's the thing. They believe this. They are bought in. They have legions of fans. Most of them taught a crude form of this science from their parents and communities during childhood, maybe reinforced by some traumatic brush with other races in early adulthood. These scientific-sounding arguments that confirm these basic biases are strong attractions to lonely, isolated people, and they are not going away. Race realism is as alive and well as any other human prejudice you can imagine. Whether it's listening to people like Stefan Molyneux, Richard Spencer, or Jared Taylor, you can see these views sprouted out by your own kids' favorite YouTubers such as JonTron, and even some of the biggest politicians in our country. And this should be a warning to the left. The students of Middlebury College really fucked up here. They made this asshole look dangerous. And people want to fuck Dangerous. They made him look punk rock. They turned this guy, this grumbling quack troll, into Elvis Presley, while these young, educated warriors of justice played the role of the stuck-up old pricks screaming to keep their young daughters from wanting to fuck him. The Charles Murrays of the world need to speak. They need to get published. They need to get their ideas out. And we all of us, need to combat him with his own idiocy, with his own bad science, with his dumb ass ideas. With true science and true revelation, James Flynn debates Charles Murray. He reads him, he engages with him, and you know what? He discredits him. Rick Nevin dismantled his entire set of assumptions from his 800-page book with just a 24-page paper looking at the same data with a much keener scientific eye and shrewder assertions. And look, I know it's easy for me to say I'm a straight white cis male. Charles Murray isn't calling me inferior. Charles Murray isn't calling my father stupid. Charles Murray isn't saying that my mother is barely above an animal. Charles Murray is not giving credit and voice to men who want to measure my genitals and assume that they prove that I'm a raping barbarian or that my granddad was. I get that Charles Murray hurts you in a very real way and that he enrages you. He is impugning your very self-worth. He is disinformation. He is poison. But I know how to fight this guy. You read him, you think, you study, you fight for what you believe, you show up and you make this guy account for his bullshit. He should not even be a footnote in history, but the way you do that is to discredit him and move on, which it turns out is very easy to do. I just did it and I'm barely literate. When you silence him, it gives people the feeling that he has something to say. When you silence him, you are also silencing yourself. No one can hear your right answers to his wrong bullshit. You gotta get out there and fight these assholes and their pathetic followers. They have huge audiences, and audiences that vote. And I would say to the people of Middlebury College, this guy and the people who read these books, they're the future that you're choosing to ignore. They are the future you're shouting down. And if that doesn't scare you, then maybe you should come out of the hug box.
Still offering to the drum machine, you couldn't have a face on my heart. The stars in the streaming color, the odd symbol repeated.